terrific, Richard. This is that you and I have been here to a number of these international UFO Congress meetings.
Right.
I remember that I was invited for the first time in 1994 to come to do a presentation. I've been here for like 16 years of them. And I knew that I kept passing you by in the hall and we would talk, and I always kept, because I've been involved with a lot of national security state things, the Pentagon Papers case,
Exactly.
Iran-Contra, et cetera.
Absolutely.
And I said, this is fascinating that Richard is talking about the national security state and its whole relationship to the UFO issue. And I said, I really want to get to sit down and talk with him sometime. And every time we come to these things, we're both getting dragged off to different interviews and things. And so I said,
That's the life.
yeah, so that's the life. So they asked me, they said, look, we've got some time, we want to sit down and do a shoot of a conversation. He said, who of all the people that are involved in the UFO Congress would you want to have this conversation with? And I said, look, there's no question about it at all. It's Richard Dolan.
Thank you very much, Dan.
And so I wanted to do is if we could just, if you and I could respectively reflect upon how we both each kind of got drawn into this whole issue of the extraterrestrial issue and the UFO issue, and then reflect upon what kind of changes we've each seen during the course of our experience with it to get us up to date as to sort of where we think we are now, so we can then chat about this, and it might be helpful for people.
Well, it's fascinating to do that. I think when I look at it from my point of view, I see tremendous personal changes in how I've perceived the UFO phenomenon. But yeah, I think there have been changes on the broader scale too.
Yeah.
For myself, I'm amazed when I think about how many permutations I've gone through and what I think about this, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 1994, I was just getting started looking at this problem at all, and in fact I knew really nothing about it. I was working on a doctoral dissertation in Cold War studies at that time. I was basically focusing on Harry Truman and the Soviets and the national security strategy circa 1950.
Mm-hmm.
In that kind of environment, they don't do much on flying saucers. That's just not what they study.
Yeah, I noticed that. Kissinger never talked about it much in Gov 182 either.
No, right.
Right.
So I recall I was in a bookstore, and I happened across a copy of Timothy Good's Above Top Secret. The subtitle of that is The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. And it really got my attention. It's a big fat book, and I thought, wow, kind of cool. I flipped through the book. I'll never forget this, and I recognized many of the names that he had in that book from my own study. I thought, that's interesting. Why have I not read about this in an academic context? If they're interested in UFOs, even if they're wrong, why is that not part of our history? That's fascinating. And so I thought, well, I'm going to buy this book, and I read it. And I became intrigued, and really what I ended up doing was gathering my own bibliography of a UFO library, kind of a starter library. I thought that I would take out 2 or 3 months of my life and solve this riddle for myself, my own personal satisfaction, as to what I thought UFOs were. And that turned into not even an avocation, but really an obsession. And I just ended up, the result of that was I wrote UFOs in the National Security State, which came out in 2000. And I've just kept going. Back in the early years, I assumed that we were just dealing with mechanical objects that came from some other planet, presumably. And, the crazy thing is the longer you stay in this field, the more exposed you become to some very, very strange ideas indeed, coming from very credible people. And so at this point, my view of the world it's not even remotely what I considered my view of the world back in 1994. And I have to assume that another 10 years from now, it'll be very different still.
Well, that's interesting. I know that I came in 1994 here. The first invitation that I had to come to the UFO Congress. They'd had 4 of them. That was the 4th one I think that they had. And I had been involved with Dr. John Mack, the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Mm-hmm. And I had represented him in front of the Harvard faculty committee before which he had been challenged basically for his writing of a book on abductions, the whole abduction phenomenon. And he had attempted to write an article for the New England Journal of Medicine about this whole phenomenon of people having this experience and trying to explore what the repercussions of this were. And they rejected it and refused to publish the article about it. And they had actually, he was so upset that he wrote a book about it. And the dean of the Harvard Medical School asked John to come to meet with him to discuss this book. And when John showed up, it turns out that they had assembled the lawyer for Harvard University, a bunch of faculty members, and the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, John Relman, were all there, arrayed up on this dais, and they were going to be interrogating him about this. And
Incredible.
so he contacted his best friend, who had been his best man at his wedding, and asked if he might contact me and see if I would represent him, since I'd graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School and been to the Div School, that would I be willing to represent him in front of the Harvard faculty. And so I did. And it was in that context that I was asked to come to the UFO Congress in 1994 to give a report to everybody as to how things were going with Dr. John Mack. And but I had been involved earlier in it. In 1997 or 1977, it was actually almost 20 years earlier than that. I had been contacted when I was chief counsel for the Jesuit National Headquarters in Washington by Marcia Smith, who was the head of the Science and Technology Division of the U.S. The Library of Congress, their Congressional Research Service. And President Carter, when he had come into office in 1976, he had made an inquiry to get access to all the information they had about the UFO issue and the ET issue. And so I was contacted by Marcia Smith, who'd been tasked to undertake this task through the Congressional Research Service, to see if I could get access to the classified sections of the Vatican Library to find out what they had on ETs and the UFO issue. And that was how I became involved in this at the beginning, and was shocked that the Vatican Library would not give legal counsel for the Jesuits access to the sections of the library on ETs and UFOs. And so I went through a series of steps to try to deal with this whole thing.
Did you find, to your satisfaction, that there was an ET section to the?
Oh, there clearly is. There's not any doubt about that. Not any doubt about that. And so what I did is, over the years, at that stage, I had, because of my experience with that whole affair, when we helped organize through the Jesuit National Headquarters in Washington, a Washington Interreligious Staff Council, to have the heads of all 54 of the major religious denominations in the United States come together each month in Washington to discuss what policies they wanted to have dealt with by Congress. I recommended that they put the ET issue on as a task force to look at this. And there was this dead silence in the room. And Judy Stone, who was the Washington rep for them, she just, when I said, I think we ought to consider this issue of the extraterrestrial presence, and she just looked around at all the other leaders in the room, and she said, are there any other ideas that people
that took some guts to say that.
Well, but actually, my experience has been that it is actually an act of cowardice that causes people not to say things that should be said. And so I just always grew up thinking that, well, you can't be a coward. It doesn't take extreme courage. It just takes normal human common sense when that's not usually allowed. And so the kind of response that got, of that, look, this was not even acceptable to talk about at all. And that you can't, this isn't a legitimate issue to be dealt with.
Right.
So that I saw happen over the period of time from 1977, when I was involved in this at that early stage, and was asked to brief the SETI scientists, the top 50 scientists at the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, on the theological implications of this. It was all very, very revolutionary at that time. Even though they were engaged in the activity, they were, of course, listening for radio signals from various star systems, in that there was absolutely no concept on their part, of these scientists, that it might be true.
That there might actually be extraterrestrials here. Right, exactly.
And the whole UFO phenomenon and the abduction phenomenon, they were kind of oblivious to that whole thing, which struck me as a little astonishing. And so that over that whole period from 1977, what is it now, 1980 is 20, is 30, is 30, 33 years that I've been involved in this thing. I was astonished to kind of watch this unfolding take place, pursuant to which, when the Hubble telescope went up, and they started realizing that the approximately 100 million star systems that they thought were in our galaxy, they began to discover that there were probably more like 200,000, and then like 200 million,
Yes, exactly.
200 billion. And then they really got to the realization that there's like 500 billion star systems in our galaxy.
Yeah.
And that there's 500 billion trillion galaxies.
Make some revisions to the Drake equation necessary.
That's
as well.
right, some radical revisions. And
Right.
so that once the data was coming in from the Hubble telescope, and they started realizing the vastness of this whole operation here in our cosmos, and then when they started discovering planets, this is like 1995.
Yeah, really in the last 10, 15 years
That's right.
tops, we've started
First
recognizing.
one, 1995, that they suspected from the wobble of the star, and then when they started cranking the Hubble up to really start looking for these planets, that they have discovered, as of last year, at the end of 2008, they had discovered 373 of these planets.
Well, planetary formation, I think, is now just considered to be a very natural byproduct of star formation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then in 2009, they discovered 32 new planets just that year.
Yeah.
And then when the Vatican came forward in November of 2009, this is less than 90 days ago, basically, as we sit here, and decided they were going to hold a conference at Castel Gandolfo, which is the estate where the Pope has his summer residence, and it's where the observatory, the Vatican Observatory is, that they were going to convene a conference of scientific experts around the world to brief the Vatican on the likelihood of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence.
Yeah, that's an amazing development, is it not?
And the
Yeah.
press conference that followed that on the 10th of November at the Holy See, at the Vatican itself, in its official press office, that the Jesuit priest who is the director of the Vatican Observatory, that Jose Gabriel Funes, chaired this press conference. And they announced at the press conference, and this was Christopher Ippy, who is an astronomical professor at the University of Arizona, who was a participant in the conference. They sponsored him standing up and saying the high probabilities are that our human family is likely to establish contact with an extraterrestrial civilization in just a few short years, was what he actually said.
Really?
That's what he said. And Father Funes then followed his comments by saying that the time has now arrived at which serious consideration needs to be given to the profound philosophical and theological questions that are going to be raised by our human contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. He just basically gave the green light to everybody in the Catholic Christian community to have to start coming to grips with this issue. So I said to myself, look, we need to start figuring out how to respond to these questions. And most people would have thought, because of my particular background, dealing with national security state issues in Iran-Contra and the Silkwood event and the whole Pentagon Papers event, that I would have immediately run out and said, look, it's the public policy questions that need to be dealt with, the political questions of them keeping this secret all the time from us, et cetera.
Sure.
And so what I said is, look, there needs to be a two-track analysis. There needs to be an analysis of the political implications, the public policy implications of all of this, but we also have to be dealing with the philosophical and theological implications of this about our self-image as human beings. And so I said so I get the call from the UFO Congress that would I come as the former chief counsel for the Jesuit office in Washington, its social ministry office, would I be willing to come and address the philosophical and theological implications of this? And so I was saying to myself, gee, that's going to be really an important challenge. But I want to make sure that the public policy issues are addressed, the exopolitics of the whole UFO issue. And then I said to them, this needs to get covered. And they said, Richard Dolan is going to be here. And I said, great. I said, good, we're going to be able to get a philosophical discussion, a theological discussion, and the public policy implications. And so I thought that since each of us have delivered our respective presentation here, each got our own 2 hours to kind of address these respective
and
issues.
without even planning it, we really dealt with the same exact
Same
issue.
exact issues.
Yeah.
Same exact issues.
Right.
And so I said, so that when I was approached by the people, and they said, look, shouldn't you sit down and have a conversation with somebody that you think is the most important person here? And I said, yes, let's get Richard Dolan. Let's sit down and talk about this between ourselves.
Yeah.
And this could be helpful, I think, for the people at the conference.
Yeah, I agree. And well, where would we like to begin on this, Dan?
Well, let's move to the political implications of this. Is that you and I both are, in a sense, political creatures. We were doing our graduate work in
Right.
this field of international relations and public policy issues, et cetera, and that based upon your exploration in preparing 2 of the 3 major volumes on the issue of the national security state and the UFO phenomenon, what is it that you have come to believe, based upon your research of the official internal government documents and the secret memos that went back and forth that they fought off the American public? What have you come to believe is actually going on from the point of view of our United States government and the other nation-state governments of the world about this issue?
I think I can answer that on really 2 levels. The first fundamental level is absolutely take to the bank unarguable fact. And that bottom line fact is that for 60 plus years, we have had an enormous interaction with an unknown technology and an unknown intelligence. Primarily, well, in one case, through the fact that our jets are chasing these things. All right, so this is where the national security aspects come in. Anyone who's a skeptic who doesn't believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial, my attitude is to say, well, I don't really even care if they're extraterrestrial. What I know is that there's an issue here because we've got jets, fighter interceptor jets being scrambled. Every single year we have new cases of this. Now, they could be a secret terrestrial project, I suppose, but even if that were the case, it still begs the question of why we're chasing them. And why are they able to do things that aren't supposed to be true or aren't supposed to be possible, such as stopping in midair and taking off instantaneously and so forth. So at the very basic level, in terms of public policy, what we can be asking our political leaders is, who is flying these objects and what makes them do the things that they do, and why is there no public discussion on this that's really adequate to the situation? So that's the fundamental. Now, beyond what we know is true, and we know that's true, there's what things look like. And I guess what I would say to that is, based on my research into this, both in the confirmed documents, that is, materials taken from the National Archives, I've been to the ones in the United States and Canada at this point, and I've looked at a lot of papers, and I've studied a lot of the other archival research done by other people as well in this field. And also based on my own interviews that I've conducted now with countless individuals involved in this phenomenon. My assessment is that our species right now, at this point in our history, is of intense interest to probably what looks like a number of extraterrestrial or non-human intelligences that are watching us. They're looking at us right now. Now, they've probably been looking at us all along, but the fact is that in the last 100 years, human race has gone through a series of revolutions, and we're not done. 100 years ago, we had a society of horses pulling carts. That was the human race. We go from that to having automobiles, to having radios, to having aircraft, to having televisions, to having atomic bombs, to having computers, nanotechnology now we're developing, all kinds of integrated circuits. We're going to be having artificially intelligent computers probably in 10 to 15 years. Quantum computing, I don't even know what that is, except that computer scientists say that quantum computing will be to our current computing what our current computing is to the Gutenberg printing press. In other words, and that doesn't even get into the changes in biotechnology, genetics that we're looking at. In other words, look, in the blink of a cosmic eye, we have reinvented our civilization, and we are very probably reinventing our species. So that's just so fast. Any observing intelligence I assume, has got to be aware of this. And they've got to be looking at us right now, understanding that we're about to leap into their world. As I sometimes think of it, we've probably been in that world all along, only asleep, but now we're about to wake up. So that's one very important facet of this phenomenon. So the question is, though, how is this reality going to come out in the open, this acknowledgement of an extraterrestrial presence here in our world? Because on the one hand, when you look at the political side of it, I see no motivation, really none, of the political leadership, the secret holders, to give this information up. Here's how I see the whole thing having played out. If we rewind the clock back to the 1940s and pretend that we're in with the in crowd, and we discover that, yes, this phenomenon appears to be involving non-human intelligences. And not only that, but we've recovered some of their technology. So this presents us with a very difficult situation. What do we do about it? Do we tell the world? I have a feeling that some of the decision makers, maybe even Harry Truman, might have had an instinct to want to tell the world. I don't think that they wanted to be bad guys here, but they had a couple of things to consider. One was the existence of this Cold War, whereby if you tell the world you've got this piece of alien artifact, suddenly it becomes very difficult not to share it. It's easier just to keep it to yourself if you don't tell anyone that you've got it. And if you keep it to yourself, then you can have your scientists study it. You can figure out all kinds of new scientific pieces of information and give yourself leverage in this Cold War. And I really believe that this is a prime early motivation.
Yeah.
I think it's entirely likely that somebody like Truman would have said, well, let's figure out a game plan here. We've got this technology, and we also don't want to panic the world. So what I'm going to do is convene this group of people, and your job will be to figure out what we can do with the technology. Your job will be to manage the media. Your job will be to find out how bad public panic might be. And your job will be to find out who these other beings are, and so forth. I think that's exactly what happened. And he might have decided in a few years we'll reconvene and decide our game plan. The problem with keeping a secret, though, is that, as I see it, it develops its own momentum and its own profitability. And what I am convinced now has happened is that this secret has moved away from the public sector, and I think it has gone private, so to speak. The way I see it as having happened is that this piece of technology that we've studied goes to, say, General Dynamics, General Electric, Lockheed, wherever. And at some point, one of their scientists is going to have some eureka moment. They're going to figure out a way to improve electromagnetism, or they're going to figure out a way to make high tensile fibers, or any number of other inventions, fiber optics, let's say. Suddenly, we can ask ourselves, well, what's their motivation now for giving this secret? None.
You're right, right.
It's the goose that lays golden eggs. And so the further down this road we get, I think the less incentive they have for giving the secret up. And then it becomes more and more difficult to tell the world, well, it's been 50 years. I guess we can now tell you that we've been working the ET technology trade.
Yeah. And lying to the public when the
Absolutely.
public keeps demanding to know what's going on with these UFOs, and they keep saying, look, there's nothing to this, that we've explored this in detail. You know,
Absolutely.
people who think about this stuff are nuts, you know, and that we've had a covert operation going to kind of to ridicule these people, et cetera,
and
which
an
is all
inf-
revealed
and
by
an
the documents
infrastructure,
now.
an entire deep black infrastructure that's evolved. Suddenly there's a lot of explaining to do, and people are going to want to know, how were you able to hide this from the mainstream media, the political institutions, the academic world? And once those questions begin to be raised, there's going to be a lot of hell that will break loose, because it will become obvious that those major institutions, what are supposed to be the watchdog institutions of the public, have been managed by the national security community. That will not be a fun moment to have to explain that.
That's right. And that this is this interesting enough is the field in which I basically specialize as an attorney. And that, you know, I've come to realize that since the imposition of the national security state bureaucracy in our democracy in 1947, that there's been this entire envelope within which not only this issue but other issues have been concealed. And so that there's
Yes.
an entire elite governing class that makes decisions, and that there's a strictly tactical decision made on their part as to what they're going to say to the people. about all these secrets, and that they have developed a rationale for lying. That part of it is just not telling people, but it's lying. It's making up false stories. It's ridiculing people who try to pretend that the truth is as it is, this is a difficult sell for the American people as a whole, because the American people have, again, the national security state has generated an entire counterintelligence program in which they assert that anybody who believes in any conspiracies whatsoever, like the conspiracies that they're engaged in to conceal things from the people, is basically a nutcase. And so that unless one is willing to challenge that basic characterization of one's whole professional life, one is just going to shy away from this entire thing. And that people in the academic community do that, people in the legal community, especially people in the political community.
Well, in the current administration of Barack Obama, one of his top advisors created an extended piece on exactly this theme, on the need to disable conspiracy theories in the United States because they actually can be a public danger as well.
Exactly. And so that when you started out beginning to look into this area, you were interested in the international relations field of Soviet-American relations,
Exactly.
et cetera. How would you characterize your level of political consciousness at that point as compared to now?
Well, right. At that time, I thought I was pretty much ahead of the curve. When I look back, I think I really knew next to nothing about what was actually going on. The whole first year that I studied UFOs was the year that I spent in bed at night staring at the ceiling. You know, I get good sleep now, but during that first year, the problem that I had was trying to incorporate this new reality into what I thought I knew. What I find is that many of us, probably most of us in our lives, by the time the age of 30 or 35 comes around, we think we've got it figured out. And then we normally...
Or at least we've given up on trying to figure it out in any different way.
Exactly.
Right.
And we think, well, we're grown up now, so we should have our philosophy in place. And then I think, you know, what our instinct is to spend the rest of our lives filling in the blanks of what we think we know. And I'm afraid that maybe that would have been a path that I would have gone on as well. Fortunately, I bumped into the UFO phenomenon, and what it did is it completely turned my world upside down. Because then, after I became convinced that, yes, this is a reality, then all of the history I thought I knew, take your pick about the Kennedy administration or the Eisenhower administration or any of them, was missing something very important. And so the real thing I wanted to figure out was, well, what's missing and what's the true history here? How do I even learn this? How do I figure it out? And I've spent the last 16 years trying to do that. But it required a reevaluation, a new philosophical outlook. One of the things that it made me have to consider was the nasty little conspiracy theories that are supposed to be off limits. Because it occurred to me that, well, this is a reality here and it's not being talked about, so what does that say? Is everyone just stupid, really dumb, or are they being very intelligent and trying to put this issue aside and
deceive people about
Absolutely.
it? When we reflect upon this, that there are people that are going to be, you know, possibly showing this videotape, you know, to their churches, in their public library, at their, you know, high school, et cetera. What is it? Well, I think we should both share with them what are some of the particular or specific things that you learned in a way that was beyond contesting. By looking at official documents that they'd fought and resisted and finally had to cough them up to you,
Right.
et cetera. You know, what are some of the specific things that you looked at and saw that convinced you that this was such a kind of a revolutionary reality?
Yeah, great question. I would say reading the many massive documents that were released by the United States government during really the glory era of the Freedom of Information Act. A lot of people don't realize the Freedom of Information Act really only got some teeth in the mid and late 1970s. And ever since it's had its ups and downs. But in the late 70s, during the Carter years primarily, to the shock of many, many people, thousands of pages of documents relating to UFOs were released by many government agencies, the FBI, CIA, many of the defense agencies, released documents pertaining to UFOs that were requisitioned by UFO researchers. from the National Archives. These were documents that were created back in the 50s and 60s with no expectation that they would ever see the light of day. For years and years, the U.S. government had said, well, we don't really study the UFO issue, we're not interested. Suddenly, that lie was exposed very clearly. A number of these documents are absolutely top-rate, fascinating documents. Now, I wouldn't say that any one of them by themselves would offer proof that UFOs are alien, let's say. However, when you take the top 10, top 20, they provide overwhelming evidence that A, the phenomenon is real, B, very serious, and C, of grave concern to military authorities. For instance, there's one that's very well known to researchers. Let's call it the 1947 Twining Memo. Yeah. This was written by three-star general at the time, General Nathan Twining. He later went on to get 4 stars and become Chief of Staff of the Air Force. In 1947, he was responding to a request by another general who wanted to know, essentially, what was all this flying saucer business about? Are we making it? Are we not making it? Do I have to do anything about it? To which Twining wrote a multiple-page document saying, the phenomenon, the reported phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious. And then he, incredibly, goes on to describe the nature of these objects as they were coming into the military personnel who were reporting them, including metallic, round on top, domed on top, flat on the bottom. Now, what is domed on top and flat on the bottom, especially in 1947? Silent or nearly so, very quiet, evasive maneuvers when sighted, and so forth. And so this is not evidence, but proof that in 1947, a top U.S. general is confirming the existence of this phenomenon. And you can just take it from there. Through the rest of the 40s, through the 50s and 60s, we've got dozens of excellent documents showing the scrambling of U.S. jet interceptors to intercept objects that were round or disc-shaped, hovering and hanging out over very sensitive U.S. military installations, including nuclear sites like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and Hanford. You know, back in those days, you don't just go and fly over these restricted places. It was a big deal. And the base commanders were deeply concerned over this. And so we've got really scores of excellent documents relating to that. To me, that's more than sufficient to show that something's going on. It doesn't have to prove that it's alien, but guess what? What we find out is that all of the analysts back then asked all of the logical questions that we would ask. Top on the list is, top on the list is were the Soviets making them? They wanted to know this. Are we making them? Or are they interplanetary? That was the big phrase that they were using. Yes. And inevitably, with all of these various studies that took place within the military, there was always a significant faction that said, well, they look interplanetary. And
the documents that I've seen from reviewing them is that they said, we now know to a certainty they're not Soviet.
Exactly.
And we know to a certainty they're not ours. And that all of our intelligence circles show us that they don't come from any other nation on our planet.
Absolutely.
And that was what they were saying in the documents.
There has never been any real proof, and really not even strong evidence, that the Soviets were making these objects, or that they were American objects. Now, I've often considered it likely that in what we call the classified, the black world, that we've had our own efforts to replicate flying saucers.
Oh, yes.
And I personally believe that there's been success there.
Yeah, I believe that's true.
And that's muddied the field a lot. So when you see something that's really unusual, you wonder, are we making it? But you go back to the 1940s, and I have a difficult time wrapping my brain around the idea that this is a black project when in fact we're chasing them.
That's right.
What kind of classified project are you going to have where your own jets are chasing them for 60 years?
And being given orders to shoot them down.
Exactly. Exactly.
You know, that based upon my 40 years as a professional investigator, that is completely and totally inconsistent with the purported reality of these things.
There's no logic to it.
There's no logic to it whatsoever. It's completely contrary to my experience. And so that when I was actually given access to the classified sections of Project Blue Book, and
one of the most amazing stories in modern ufology, by the way. I mean, it's really an incredible story.
It was a fascinating story, and in that when I was actually given access to the classified portions of Project Blue Book, and it surprised everyone that it happened. Surprised Marcia Smith, and I dare say Marcia Smith has been upset at me since then for telling everybody about it. That she has stayed within that realm of the trusted confidants, but when I saw the photographs of absolutely, and these are like, it was in the 1940s, you could tell, because they had an Air Force crew in the photographs filming this crashed site on the ground, and they had one of those big dual reeled cameras that they were actually, so you could place the time when this was, and it had the symbols on it that were not Russian, they were not Chinese, they were not anything at all that I had ever seen anywhere in all my studies, and that I physically traced them out to actually identify these things. And when I came to the realization that look, this is true, that the internal documents are revealing that it's true, the conduct that they're engaging in are true, and the photographs that I've now seen convinced me that it's true, I moved immediately to trying to get the National Council of Churches, as I mentioned, to place this on a high-level agenda for the public policy issues that we ought to be dealing with. And it was perfectly evident that they didn't want to do this, that they were not going to do this.
If I may ask you,
Yes.
or actually let me point out
Yes.
that I think it's important for people to understand just how you were able to see this. I mean, it was really
Yes.
a one-shot kind of deal, it seems to me.
Yeah, yeah.
It was part of the Carter Initiative for you to work with Marcia Smith
Yes.
to gain information on the UFO ET phenomenon.
Yes.
Okay. And for that, you were allowed to visit these classified records.
Yes.
I'm not aware of anyone in the public realm having been able to do that ever since.
Right, no,
I think this is the only time.
That's right, because it turns out that it was never said that they had declassified this particular section. We're going to make this available to the public,
Right.
or even to the Library of Congress.
Exactly.
But what they did was this peculiar thing of saying, you're going to be authorized to go and look at them.
Right.
And I didn't have to take any security oath or anything. That and so when I went to do this, I just went in and looked at these, and it was very peculiar, because when I look back upon it, I said I should have stayed in there as long as I possibly could. I should have looked at all kinds of stuff, and I kick myself now. I said, how could a guy that's sophisticated and involved in national intelligence investigations and everything, how could you not have just taken maximum opportunity to look at everything you could look at?
Well, I love the story about how you snuck the images out.
That's right. Well, what I said when I was allowed to come into this room where all these documents were, that they said, look, you can't take the briefcase in there, and you're not going to be allowed to take any notes. Well, I happen to have already under my arm a yellow pad, and so I just walked into this room with these two great big suits outside, these big national security type guys standing outside the door, and I went in and I had the yellow pad with me. So when I came to the photographs of this crashed flying saucer, there wasn't any doubt about what it was, and you could tell that the people that were filming it and taking pictures of it in these pictures, Air Force people, they clearly were quite excited about what it is that they were looking at there. And when it had these symbols on it, when I saw those symbols, it was just this kind of peculiar moment. I looked at these symbols and I said, this is something from another world. And so what I did is I had this microfiche machine. That they were on these little microfiche. They were these little boxes. There must have been 100 of these little boxes, shoebox size things, with these filled with little microfiche. So I had this microfiche thing. It was like 4 or 5 or 6 of these little microfiche into when I found this thing. And what I did is I didn't even hesitate. What I did is I took the yellow pad and I opened it up to the cardboard backing of the thing, of the inside of it.
Yes.
And I put it under the microfiche thing, and I focused it up, and so I could get a close-up of what the symbols were. And then I traced them, literally, physically. I was so careful. So look, I want this to be absolutely, precisely exact. And so I traced it and then when I closed up the yellow pad, for some reason I said, I had better get out of here now. I've got this. They told me that I shouldn't take any notes. I wasn't taking any notes. I traced this thing. And so
If you want to get technical.
So if I want to get well, that's what lawyers do. And so I figured that, so I had it, and I wanted to get out of there before they came in and took it away from me. And so I put the yellow pad under my arm, I put the thing all back in there, and I put it all away, and I got up and walked out. And as I was walking out the thing, I said, okay, I'd like to get my briefcase now. They handed me my briefcase, and I started to walk away, and one of the two guys said, hold it, what is that under your arm there? And I said, oh, I looked around. No, what he actually says, what is that you got there? I said, well, this is my briefcase. That's what I said to him. I said, this is my briefcase. You just gave it back to me. No, he says, under your arm there. And I said, oh, yeah, that's just a yellow pad. He reached out and snatched it away from me. And he kind of got all palms, and he went over to where there was some light, and he riffled through all the yellow pages in the thing, and of course nothing was on them. So he went, oh, okay, right, and he handed it back to me. And so I took it, and the following Monday morning I brought it in and gave it to Father William J. Davis, the head of the Jesuit office there, and gave it to him and showed him what was there and explained to him what I had seen.
Yes.
And he surprisingly said, I've never said anything to you about this, but my sister is married to a guy who is in the tower at the either Seattle or Spokane, Washington airport. He's an air traffic controller, and one of his best friends, who's a commercial pilot, had taken a photograph of a UFO during one of his flights, and I've got it right here. And he opened up his drawer and he showed me the photograph. He gave me the photograph.
It's the amazing thing about this, because when you start talking to people about this, you find everyone has had some kind of connection with it.
That's right. And they all believe it's true, and that they don't dare say anything about it because of the ridicule factor. So we came to the point where you had become convinced that this was true.
Right.
I had become convinced that this was true, and then everybody seemed to be focusing all of their attention on trying to prove to each other that it was true. Mm-hmm. And the whole discourse in the UFO community was all, is it true? Is it possibly true?
Right.
And what I started thinking about was, given the fact that it's true, and I'm now positive that it's true, why can't I get the religious institutions to start thinking about what the theological and philosophical implications of this really are? Because it seems like we ought to get on with this. We ought to get on with it. It's like being on a first date, and discovering, okay, now what?
I'm with you there, and part of me keeps thinking, well, you've spent 33 years. I've spent almost half. I've done 16 now, about half that. And so, right, we've gone through this, but the fact is, you have family, I have family, I have friends. We all know that a lot of people are still not on board, and it's not that they're naturally skeptics, but they just don't know. What I find is that there's a large, overwhelming amount of just lack of knowledge, unfortunately, by the general public over just how widespread this phenomenon is. And the thing that's sad, in my opinion, is I've met so many people who've had these sightings, as have you. And it's usually the most extraordinary thing that they've ever seen.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't tell anybody because they don't want to be laughed at. There's a ridicule factor there. There are a lot of people who've experienced a lot of psychological effects that really aren't good because it's traumatic, and they get a lot of generalized anxiety as a result, and yet they still can't talk about it. And to me, this doesn't say good things about our society that we do that to these people.
Right.
And it's yet another aspect of the broader social effects of secrecy. And I guess I'm bringing this up because I'm thinking in terms of public policy, this is just yet another example of the kinds of things that we're going to have to deal with.
Yes.
And in terms of religion as well, frankly, because when...
Yeah, the political structures are not going to release the factual reality of this until they're convinced that the philosophical and theological ground has been set for people to accept it, because they aren't going to want to suffer the political consequences. And so I think that what we need to do, that I believe that until such time as we, as the laity of the churches and the civilians in the governmental structures, demonstrate that we're basically just not going to stand for this anymore. Mm-hmm. That the fact of the matter is we're not going to sit here like adolescents and wait for our father figures to tell us it's okay, to tell us that, that okay, it exists, and here's what the theological explanation of this is, and here's the philosophical, that we need to do this ourselves. We need to take to heart basically the lessons of Vatican II. that in fact the church is not the cardinals and the hierarchy and the rabbis and everything. It's the people.
I think it's a great
ourselves.
point. I hadn't really, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I think about the religious and philosophical implications, but for a long time, I think I really wanted to put those aside. And I'd always focused on the political aspect of it. But I think that really what you're talking about here is very interesting, because if you can change the culture, and the religion is such an important part of it, if you can affect major decisions in the world's great religions, affect different policies, you can go a long way toward changing the fundamentals of the society, and which I think would make a political change a lot easier.
Than the secular. My experience in being a gov major at Harvard and studying at law school stuff is that the people who in fact run for and retain political office in the United States are not leaders. They're not leaders at all. They're basically, most of them are engaged in kind of an attempt to verify their own ego. They're the same kind of people that the presidents of the fraternities and all that. They're BMOC types, the big men on campus types that like to strut around. You know, and I've dealt with them for 20 years in Washington, D.C., that they exercise very little leadership. In fact, I've had dozens of instances where I'm sitting with a United States Senator or a congressperson, and I tell them, look, here are the facts of this thing. Here's the right things you need to do. And they look at me and say, you go out and get all kinds of people to tell me that I have to do this and make me do this, and I'll do it.
So in other words, the people have to be the leaders.
The people have to take the leadership on this thing. And so that what I want to do is I want to start directing our attention toward establishing a grassroots operation that is going to engage in disclosure rather than wait for disclosure from the secular government, and are going to engage in the philosophical and theological types of discussions that have to be undertaken, not waiting for the cardinals and the bishops and the popes to tell us what the answers to that are. And so that what my experience has been is that the reason that Vatican II took place in 1961 to 65, basically under John the 23rd, is that he realized that the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was kind of trapped in a medieval kind of theology.
That's right.
That they had crafted a theology that was designed for people, 99% of whom were illiterate and didn't know anything, and had no schooling, had no education whatsoever. And so the church at that time was attempting to take very sophisticated concepts about consciousness and the way the universe came into being and how the human family has evolved and all of that, and try to condense it into some kind of a story that could be communicated to people that were illiterate. And because the way institutions do, they tend to ossify around their story, that the institution kind of ossified around this medieval understanding of theology and religion. And basically they've continued to treat the people as though they're illiterate and ignorant. And because of that, they've gotten themselves trapped. And I think that John the 23rd recognized that it was essential to try to bring the Catholic Christian Church up into the 20th century.
Exactly.
And their resolution was that, look, the key operative principle of Vatican II is to understand that the people are the church. That it's not the cardinals, and it's not the bishops. That the bishops are not going to take a leadership role in changing this story. The people have to develop a new story for ourselves.
Vatican II really is the great success and the great model upon which we can kind of base future
That's absolutely right.
ideas.
But it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I remember when after Vatican II they reformed, for example, the dietary rules about eating meat on Friday and all of that. And they actually, when they took eating meat on Friday off the list of mortal sins.
Mortal sin.
It was a mortal sin. A mortal sin is one that kills your soul immediately, and you go to hell permanently and forever. I mean, this is a major enforcement mechanism the Catholic Church had in its hand. And so what they did is they changed that rule as part of Vatican II. and that they actually had to have a video or at that time a film of John the 23rd sitting down at the table eating a steak, and he was pointing to the calendar that showed that it was a Friday. And he would go and he'd eat steak and say, "See, look at I can eat the steak." And I remember Father Arthur.
Good thing he didn't say, "I can eat the steak, but you can't."
No. But that's what they would have. But I remember Father Arthur Brown at St. Cecilia's Church in Boston after this was done, and he was approached by this little Irish Catholic lady from South Boston, and she said, "I feel very uncomfortable about this thing about eating meat on Friday. You know, I've lived for 70 years and viewed it as a mortal sin, and the church told me that it was a mortal sin." And he said, "Well, look, here, you've seen the pictures and the videotape.
Yes.
That the Pope himself is eating meat on Friday." And she said, "Well, the Pope may go to hell, but I'm not going to." And she refused to do it. So you can see that people can get fixated with these things. And it's the nature of institutions.
Right.
Institutions have to simplify a story, wed themselves to the story, and then put it out as though it were real. And people who don't understand what an analogy is or a metaphor is for a more sophisticated idea become wedded to, they think the map is the road instead of it just being a symbol of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so that I view this intervention that's taking place in our human history, the intervention of an extraterrestrial civilization now engaging in factually what we both come to understand is true, and what we believe we can convince reasonable people is true,
yes,
based upon the internal documents of the government, our government itself, is true, that the time has come for us to start moving into starting to ask those philosophical and theological questions, starting to figure out what we think the political solutions are. For example, we have to decide whether or not we're willing to give amnesty to the previous government officials and the government officials that are in there right now because of their having lied to us. And, you know, if we can communicate to them that we're willing to be compassionate and forgive them for what they have done, but the fact is that the Cold War is over now. Mm-hmm. And you know, there may have been some rationale for what you did at that time, right, but for you to continue on doing this, you know, this you're going to get in trouble for if you don't don't stop doing this right now. And that surely they don't have to pretend that they need to protect this issue of flying saucers and UFO intelligence to protect themselves against Islamist fundamentalists that are basically, you know, still driving carts around in Afghanistan. So that they can't pretend that they need to conceal this for purposes of national security anymore. But that's not going to cause them to become leaders overnight when they're not leaders. That I think what we need to do is that there is a consciousness that we have to bring to the entire UFO community that is a grown-up attitude. We need to now be grown-ups, that we've had this long, protracted adolescence in which we've engaged in the first fervor of excitement, you know, of dating. Right. But now it's time now for us to contemplate marriage and families as distinct from hot dates, and that we've got to get into a more mature consideration of this, and that I'd like to engage in the philosophical and theological discourse and raise some questions that we need to try to address as people. And I think that your role, as you displayed in your presentation here this time at the UFO Congress, and I would recommend that we'll have in our packet that goes out with this video your presentation, mm-hmm, in mine, so people can see what it is we're talking about. But if we can participate in sharing the data that we know that have come to convince both of us as reasonable people, right, that this factual set is true, that what we need to start doing is identifying for people what the political issues are that they're going to have to come to deal with, what kind of range of answers they might have to consider for this, and the theological and philosophical questions. So I want to put, right, a few of the political questions, yeah, to you. One of the most important things is here this issue of amnesty that I raised. That in South Africa, as we know, that for decades, the white government, the apartheid government, suppressed the black population, lied to them, you know, mistreated them, etc. It caused a revolution to have to be generated by the ANC the American National Congress of the black people in South Africa that eventually overthrew the Afrikaner government. But at that time, those who had been suppressed for so long, had been abused and lied to, found it within themselves, under the direction of Desmond Tutu, to not only forgive those who were doing those things to them,
Yes.
but actually set up an entire formal process of reconciliation.
That's right.
And forgiveness. But they called them in and had them have to explain to them what it is they had done. What type of a process, if any, do you think should be undertaken, not initiated by the government, but initiated by our people, to try to bring about this type of a reconciliation with the wrongdoing that's been going on for these past 60 years?
It's difficult to answer that, Dan, because and I had conversation with one very high-level government insider who had, in fact, told me point blank that, yes, every 5 years or so, this issue comes up in terms of policy. That is, how to initiate a disclosure of the UFO ET reality. Because the fact is that there are many people at the high levels who do believe this secret needs to come out.
Right.
All ruling elites have their factions. Not everyone agrees, and in our own society there are those who want this out. The problem that they come up with, well, there are manifold, but one of them is legal. There's a fear, it sounds so mundane, but a fear of lawsuits. Not simply private class action lawsuits, but industrial lawsuits, business lawsuits by one contractor against another, because that contractor would have had access to exotic ET technology, violating trade practices and fair trade and so forth. Simple things, very mundane, but when you think about it, it's, yes, that makes perfect sense. And the issue is, where do you draw the line at no retribution? Should there be absolutely zero, or should there be some, maybe no jail sentences? It's a very difficult issue, and I doubt that it's going to be resolved overnight. I think it's going to be a very long process. I do agree with you that there's got to be a general tone that comes up early on, which explains that we're not out for blood here, all right? The fact is that the UFO secret has involved extra-constitutional means of keeping it going. It's involved an end run around Congress in terms of funding what we now believe are deeply secret programs to study and replicate this technology. They cost a lot of money. The whole Constitution's been subverted by the UFO secret. And what we're going to have to do, because the secret won't easily come out otherwise, is make it clear that those people who have had access to the secret are not going to be unduly punished. Now, how do we do this? Well, it seems to me that we're going to have to work through our formal institutions to enact these laws. So I would suggest that we create a citizens' lobby that works with elected representatives, congressmen and senators, to create a program. An actual platform, I think, should be devised, and I'm sure it'll be amended and changed and so on, but to come up with something that would serve as a framework for this. Certainly one thing that I think has got to be done is that the United States President, and this is at the top of my list of what has to be done, must reclaim full authority of his position as president in the name of the people of the United States. Because what I see is that the U.S. president, I think, has lost control over UFO policy, over the ET policy. Every angle that I've approached this tells me the same thing, that the president is no longer the guy in charge.
Yeah.
And
Carter and Clinton, I think, very much demonstrated that.
That's right.
That when they tried to get this information, they were told that they just didn't need to have it, and they just couldn't get it.
Exactly. And I had one informed source who indicated to me his strong belief that President George W. Bush was also not in on this secret. I also had I have another source that has told me that whereas President Obama has actually perfunctorily been briefed on the reality of this, that he has no effective authority over it. I consider this to be a good source, although you never know.
Yeah.
The point is that it looks to me that the president has lost control over this, that the groups that have control are private, powerful, financially powerful groups that, just like in every other aspect of policy, they dominate this one as well. And so I think an important step has got to be taken by whoever is president of the United States. It's got to be risky, it's gutsy, but it's got to be done to reclaim authority of this problem and to exonerate or to release those people who have taken security oaths on this topic and to enable them, without fear of legal reprisals, to talk about what they know.
Okay, let me ask you a question here. Given my experience, that the president ends up, the reason the guy gets or woman gets to be president is because they're a political animal.
Right.
That's how they get there. And that in the way that we've seen Obama, for example, when demands were made that, look, why don't we have some kind of a commission appointed by Congress or by the president to look into the crimes that were committed by the George W. Bush administration with the renditions,
right.
tortures, lying to people, fabricating evidence
And
to
he
go
let
to
it
war.
go. He just
and
let the
and
whole thing go.
what he said is like, oh, I don't want to be looking into the past. We want to look to the future. I mean,
Exactly.
he's charged constitutionally with enforcing the laws of the country. And here you have, rampant violations of law, criminal laws, and everything, and constitutional provisions, and yet he declines to do anything about it
Right.
because he's afraid of the political repercussions, not only on him but on his party.
Right.
My own particular historical experience was that when I went and briefed Tip O'Neill personally about the details of the Iran-Contra scandal, of this off-the-shelf enterprise that was functioning, with full knowledge of Donald P. Gregg, who was the National Security Advisor
Yes.
for Vice President George Bush, that Tip O'Neill said, well, what you're talking about here are impeachable offenses. They're going on here, and that unless the Democratic Party controls the Senate, which they did not at that time, then no matter what we did here in the House, it wouldn't do us any good. So you need to work with us to try to make certain that here in 1986, this was in early 86, I briefed him on it, that the Democrats get control of the Senate so that we can then have hearings that might be of an impeachable nature. He said, but what you want to do is you want to have a special select committee established to investigate this the minute that the Democrats Party gets in charge of the Senate. And he said, so what you should do is you should go talk to Claiborne Pell,
Yes.
who is the ranking Democrat in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and ask him to agree that the minute that the Democratic Party takes over control of the Senate in November of 1986, that he'll agree to ask for the appointment of a special select committee. And he said, and if you really want to make sure this gets done, ask him to have John Kerry chair it. Because he likes John Kerry, and he thinks John Kerry is going to be president someday, and he wants to participate in helping him become president. So he set up the appointment. I went and met with Claiborne Pell. I briefed him on the existence of the off-the-shelf enterprise. He was aghast at it. And then he said that if the Democrats take over in November, I'll do that. And he did do that, and he put John Kerry in. And it turns out that, little known to most people,
Kerry hit the spotlight. That was a good.
Yeah, that's right.
that was very good.
And John Kerry betrayed the American people. John Kerry, when he got all of the information in hand about knowing what was really going on, what he did is he made a deal with the Republican Party that he would not reveal any of this stuff in exchange for them, he's going to end up being the nominee for the Democratic presidency. And he got approached. He was actually approached by the Democratic Party leadership. To show you how difficult this is, the Democratic Party leadership approached him through the United States Senator from Michigan, Don Regal, and said to him, look, the Democratic Party leadership has been approached by the Republican Party leadership. And they said they know you've got the goods on them, that you've basically been given this information by the Christic Institute, and we know that you know it now. But here's the deal. If you will agree to drop your investigation, the Republican Party will agree to drop its demand for $100 million in military aid to the Contras. And all the Democrats were embarrassed about having to oppose $100 million in aid to the Contras because it made them look like they were soft on communism. And so the deal was cut that the Democrats would, in fact, agree to stop the investigation, but Kerry had to agree to that.
I see.
And so they approached him and said, look, John, we've been approached by the Republicans that they'll stop asking for the funding for the Contras, but we need to agree to step back from this investigation. And if you're willing to do that, the Democratic Party has told me to tell you that they will be very, very grateful to you personally in the immediate future, which meant that he would get the vice presidential nomination when Al Gore ran for the presidency. That was the deal that was struck.
Interesting.
And Kerry withdrew from the investigation and just lied to everybody. Said, oh, we couldn't really figure out what was going on. It was too complex. We couldn't figure out whether they really knew about the drug trafficking or not. A complete and absolute total lie. He betrayed the American people. And he squandered his political
bit of history,
career.
I had never really heard this.
No one ever
the way that
has.
been
No one ever
described
has.
like
But it's true.
Yeah.
And the only reason he didn't get the nomination from Al Gore, though Al Gore had been instructed by the Democratic Party leadership to select Kerry for his VP, the reason he selected Joseph Lieberman was because Lieberman was the first guy to stand up on the floor of the Senate and publicly condemn Bill Clinton for lying to all of his best friends in political circles, saying that he didn't have any kind of a sexual affair with Lewinsky. And the person whom he offended most above that was Al Gore. Because Al Gore had been going around telling people, I can give you my personal assurance he's had nothing to do with that woman because he told me. And I have a special relationship. And he was so furious that not only did he not allow Clinton to appear in one single political event during his entire campaign. See, people don't understand what happened here.
Yeah.
But that in fact, he in fact would not select John Kerry. He gave the award to Lieberman to be his vice presidential candidate to make it clear to Clinton what he was doing.
Right, distancing himself.
And that's why he lost the election. Okay, and then John Kerry, because he was so devoid of any integrity and having betrayed the entire progressive community that they didn't vigorously support his candidacy either when he finally got the deal. So the machinations at that level lead me to conclude that we cannot, in fact, rely in virtually any way upon any president of the United States or any congressional committee. So here's what I'm suggesting.
Well, the question is then how do we get an amnesty or some kind of forward motion?
That's the right question. That as you see now, President Obama realizes that he cannot really impose adequate constraints upon Congress and impose adequate regulations on the banks. What he has to do is appoint a commission. He says, we'll have to appoint a commission to get this outside of politics. But of course, then everybody says, well, it's got to be a bipartisan commission. They don't say a nonpartisan commission. It's a bipartisan commission, so they load it up with Republicans and Democratic political people, right? Or Les Aspin and the same old suspects that they do investigate make your recommendations, how to get out of the Afghan war, how are we going to get out of the Iran war. So what we need to do is to establish, in my opinion, a citizens commission. We have to have a citizens commission to say, look, we're not sitting around waiting for the president to appoint a commission, totally politicized, or the Congress to appoint a commission. We need to select a commission, and we can't make the same mistake they do, is that we load it up ahead of time so that we know how it's going to come out. We need to try to figure out a commission of trusted American citizens, to put them on a commission, to have them decide what position should be taken by the American people with regard to prosecuting people who have lied, punishing people politically, ousting them from office, what kind of structures we want, what kind of modifications we want on the National Security Act of 1947.
Well, I suppose if this were to take place, I mean, I don't really know how successful this could be, but maybe it could be successful if such a commission got a lot of public play.
Oh, yes.
And if that then became influential, and if the political leadership said, you know what, rather than have to fight with each other, maybe we'll just allow ourselves to be guided by this citizens commission. But otherwise, it really would be a pointless exercise.
I know.
Because there would be no way to execute
enforce
it.
And that's exactly the only reason that the federal government did anything to investigate or reveal the existence of the Iran-Contra scandal is because of the private activities that we engaged in the Christic Institute.
Well, I take your point. I think that this is an excellent idea, and for that reason, then I think it doesn't change the fact that the president has got to be the person to take the authority.
Oh, yes, that's right.
But he can be
That's right.
empowered by this a civilian,
That's right.
citizen group. So let's do that. What he's going to have to do, nevertheless, is he's going to have to liberate people who have taken security oaths on UFOs from that oath so that they can speak about
Yeah.
it without legal
Yeah,
reprisals.
and so we need, the commission has to
Necessary.
consider making that demand upon the president.
Once that happens, that will open the floodgates out, because there's going to be thousands upon
That's right.
thousands of people who are going to have their
That's
story
right.
to tell. And by then, then the problem will be sorting it all out and really making sense out of it. But we can do that.
Okay, so I'm talking about a citizens commission that not only has responsibility for formulating what type of amnesty is going to be given to government officials over this, what kind of changes need to be made in the national security bureaucracy, et cetera, the demands that we're going to make upon the government. But we have to also have some kind of a process in the citizens commission that is going to be elucidating for the American people, what the facts are about this, that what we've already come to be able to discover, so that we can, in fact, substitute ourselves, in a sense, for the responsible government officials that should have been doing this.
Well, that's right. And it's got to be done very, very, very well. So we need high quality
That's right.
debates. We need high quality policies, people, and
That's right.
everything. It's got to be
right.
done very well.
That's right.
And then it could succeed.
So that's the answer that we've sort of worked out here together on the first political question that I've asked. What do you think is the most important philosophical question or theological question that we need to address ourselves to, and so that we can try to figure out how we might, as the laity, come to grips with that? What is your sense of that?
The theology of this. First of all, we have to recognize that there's a lot of theologies in the world, and they don't all have the same attitude. My understanding, for example, as Islam, is fairly open to the idea of extraterrestrial civilizations. It doesn't conflict with the teachings of the Quran, and so that you find Muslims who are actually very open to the idea that there could be other civilizations out there. In the United States, there's a wide range of how people understand this. I think the biggest challenge, it seems to me, I'd like to know your opinion of this, is going to be dealing with people of more fundamentalist religious persuasions on this. And I really often wonder if it will even be possible for a lot of individuals ever to come to grips with this at all, and will we simply be in a position of waiting for the next generation to come in and deal with that change? Much like the example of that woman you quoted earlier, who wouldn't eat meat on Friday. She was 70 years old. She probably never did.
Yeah, no, she never
but
did,
maybe
I'm
her
sure.
grandchildren did.
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
As far as theological issues, well, certainly, look, let's get right down to it in the issue of Christianity. Because if we get to the idea that there's an extraterrestrial presence here, now we're going to get into the issue, as some have claimed, that Christ was, in fact, an extraterrestrial himself. This issue will be raised.
Sure will.
And so what would that do? Let me turn the tables and ask you this
Yeah.
question. What would that do to Christianity?
Surprisingly, this issue has been discussed for quite some time with Catholic Christianity. It started out as a discussion called the many worlds discussion. In fact, back in 1277, there was a major interesting that Fuentes, that Father Fuentes, back on November 10th, when he announced this need to probe these fundamental philosophical and theological questions at the press conference at the Vatican, he actually said that his position was that it would be placing limits upon the creativity of God to deny that there could be other worlds and other intelligent civilizations. Well, even though he didn't quote the actual source of that, that was a 1277 edict that was actually issued by the Catholic Bishop of Rome.
That's fascinating.
His name was Etienne Tempier. He was the Catholic Bishop of Rome, and he was in a major confrontation going on with Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas was engaged in the process of trying to superimpose upon the mystical Christianity of the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages a radical Aristotelian, scientific, logical worldview, which took all the way up until the First Vatican Council to get it superimposed upon them during the scientific revolution. And so that there's a long history of this going on in the Catholic Christology. And what they've finally come up with, see, once, the thing that's so exhilarating about this is that this intervention on the part of the extraterrestrial beings is going to compel the Catholic Church to come to grips with modernizing its entire communications to the people about what they mean about all of this stuff. And the fact of the matter is that if in fact one recognizes, as Teilhard de Chardin was attempting to explicate, that Jesus appears to be a biological mutation, a classic biological mutation in the ever-unfolding evolution, progressive evolution of our human family, in which he had fully evolved a faculty which is generic to the entire human family, that is evolving, a sixth sense, like seeing or hearing or tasting, that he had a faculty by means of which he could directly experientially access, like seeing or hearing, the unitive phenomenon that bonds the entire universe into unitive harmony. And that therefore, that he also could intuitively know that the physical universe was enfolded into being by an infinite and an eternal, absolute, infinite sea of entirely undifferentiated consciousness that actually abides eternally. And that it is, in fact, the phenomenon that enfolded into being the physical universe. It's a specific seventh paradigm, theological perception of the origins of the universe, that it enfolded it into being through the initial generation of a singularity in the otherwise infinite and eternal field of completely undifferentiated consciousness.
It seems to me that totally transforms Christianity. Because you lose the whole concept of original sin and redemption.
No, it doesn't. Because what it does is it points out that the original sin of which a person is guilty in the womb, is a function of separate self-consciousness, which is a function of the intellect. Intellectus being the Latin root of which is the ability to distinguish the difference between. And that the evolution of self-consciousness on the part of the human species, of perceiving ourselves as separate and apart from all the rest of creation, is in fact the original sin. And the fact is that the religious instinct, the relegare, the relinking of ourselves back into harmony with the infinite and eternal, to get back to the secret identity of ourselves, is in fact the endeavor that needs to be undertaken now. And that is the salvation dynamic. The salvation dynamic is coming to the level of consciousness to realize experientially that we are in fact at the core of our essential being, the nature, the ontological question of the nature of consciousness, is that we are in fact one and the same with the infinite and eternal consciousness. It's masked from us.
I like what you're saying. Don't misunderstand me. It does seem to me, though, that this is a very major step. I mean, you can interpret this as Christian theology, I suppose, but it seems to be very far removed from traditional Christian theology.
But the reality is that this is Christian theology, in that it is known in the upper ruling circles of the Catholic Church. The Jesuits know this, the theological fathers know this, Summa Theologica knows this. The problem was that they didn't figure out a way to explain this to the people that were uneducated.
Well, isn't it true also in the Hindu tradition? They have the Hinayana and Mahayana traditions. One is the religion of the few and of the many.
That's exactly right.
It's the same concept that seems to apply everywhere you go.
It does.
You've got the actual true spiritual truths, and then you've got the cartoon version, which you give to the rabble. Is how they look at it.
And the Sufis are the same. The Sufis have these Sufi tales.
But maybe everyone can get that.
That's exactly right. And that's what I'm saying, is that the church that has ossified around the infantile story and has gotten itself caught, like the federal government got itself caught, into the kind of lying to people in effect by masking the truth to such an extent that they had to leave themselves in a position of being the intermediary between the infinite and eternal and the great unwashed, that they're going to have to abandon that role. And they're going to have to go to the original role of actually being there to help the people, to inform the people of what this is all about.
I love this to know. So how do we get to that point? And how do we get the church to just start, because the church isn't all that there is. There's other, you've got other major world religions. You've got Judaism, you've got Hinduism, you've got, okay.
That's right.
So, but let's just talking about the church here, since that's what we're dealing with. How does one get the church to move in that direction?
We have Vatican II, in which it's explicitly acknowledged that the church ain't those guys. It isn't the cardinals and the bishops, it's the laity. And so that what we have to do is take seriously the invocation of Vatican II. They've only had 2 of them. They've only had 2 Vatican councils. And the Vatican Council that they had in the 1860s was actually the superimposition of Aristotelian scientific logical positive materialism on the theology of the Catholic Church.
That's the one where we got papal infallibility. Isn't that the one where it says that the Pope shall be infallible?
No, that actually came later.
Gotcha.
But the reality of it is, this is a radical challenge to the Catholic Church. Not that they have an awful lot to lose, because the fact of the matter is that they're falling apart at the seams right now. You know, they're losing more and more priests and nuns. That there's more and more people drifting away from the church, etc.
Well, maybe this is an opportunity then, right?
It's an amazing and important opportunity that they're being compelled to come to grips with. The fact that they too have been guilty of the same sin that the government has been involved in with regard to the ET phenomenon, that they have been concealing from the people the true theology, and that they've been garnering it into the monasteries and in secret conversations that they have among themselves, and that it's time for this secret to be revealed to the people. And the fact is that Jesus then becomes a vibrant reality in the evolution of human consciousness. But then the issue becomes consciousness itself, because consciousness itself is the secret to this whole thing, and that's what we share in common with the extraterrestrial beings, because it isn't just our intellect that we share with them, that they're an intelligent species. This is the actual briefing that I gave to the SETI, the scientists, that we aren't looking just for another intelligent species. We're looking for another species that has this same faculty of experiential discernment of the ultimate unity of all being and consciousness.
Well, let me say something that I think might tie a lot of this together. Because, look, when it happens, it's going to happen that this reality is going to come out. Because, frankly, history is moving way too fast.
Yes.
Our consciousness is evolving very, very rapidly at this point. Give it 10 years, 20 less, I don't know. It's going to happen that we are going to be confronted with the reality of an extraterrestrial civilization, or more than one, that's here. So when that happens, every single person on planet Earth is going to reevaluate their life. I guarantee this.
Sure.
They're going to be aware, instead of watching American Idol or Monday Night Football and having their consciousness focused on that level, they're going to be jolted into a situation where they're going to realize, wow, there are these other beings here, and they're operating at probably like this level up here, and I've been down here my whole life. And I think what is very likely to happen is many people, are going to see that they can change. Because look, you're never going to change until you realize you can. Realizing
until you realize
that you're able to.
Until you realize you have to.
Well, you have
Most
to.
people don't.
But then when you realize it's possible, a lot of people don't realize it's even possible to achieve a greater level of consciousness.
That's right.
And once they see that the possibility is there, I have a feeling there is going to be a great deal of effort put out by a lot of humanity to bring their level of awareness to a much higher level. And I think that this is going to have a significant effect on major world religions, and it will hopefully take us out of the cartoon level into the true level of spirituality.
That's exactly right. There are going to be 2 things that happen that, but for our intervention of this citizens movement that I'm talking about, self-disclosure, self-realization, that but for our intervention, what would happen, the instant that this revelation takes place of the existence of this extraterrestrial civilization, people are going to run and first turn on their television to see what the president is going to say.
That's right.
And then they're going to go to church. They're going to go to the synagogue. They're going to go to the mosque. That's exactly what's going to happen. And so what I'm saying is that neither one of them is prepared at the present time to know what to say. And so the fact is that, and they're not going to get prepared. They've had 60 years, both of them, that know that this is going on, and they haven't prepared themselves yet. And so what we have to do is to prepare ourselves to have the answer to this ahead of time, so that, you know, they aren't going to necessarily rush right straight to the television and say what the president's going to say about this, because they've already figured it out. And they aren't going to rush into church and say, well, what's the priest going to tell me to think about this thing? Because we've already been discussing this. And we've been holding meetings in public libraries. We've been holding meetings at the schools. We've been holding meetings in the parish halls.
Yeah.
We've been, and whether the priest wants to participate in this or not doesn't make any difference to us, because you go to the parish council. Because subsequent to Vatican II, the parish council is the one that decides what's going to be going on here, right?
Well, let me just say, in this brief conversation we've had, I think you've persuaded me that this is a really good idea. I had really been unsure about what a citizen movement really could accomplish on this. I mean, it's crazy to think that. But I was skeptical that it really could accomplish a lot. But, you know, I'm thinking about this, Stan, and I think that I think it's a great idea, because there's got to be a voice that has a well-thought-out plan. And if we can be part of an organization that is able to come up with a well-thought-out plan, the day will come when there is a shock to the world. People will be looking around for the right ideas that's going to help them get through this. And there will be organizations that might be there to help provide some initial guidance.
And I think what we want to do is we want to try to develop people in each parish around the world, and the Catholic Church has great reach around the world, in every congregation, in every mosque, that we want to have an element of their own community who has been talking with them about this, who's been inviting them to these discussions, who's been having these kind of discussions. We want to be able to have a citizens commission that's been in place, that has been articulating what the demands are that we have, has been organizing people politically to demand these kind of changes. And if in fact the legislative representatives or the presidential candidates in the two political parties don't want to be willing to do this, then you replace them. That what we do is we start to take seriously our democracy, and we start to take seriously our religion. I mean, radical suggestions, both of them.
Right.
But the fact is, I suggest that we start taking both of these things seriously before we get shocked by this whole thing, so that we don't have to get stunned into this and go running to the president or running to the Pope and asking them to tell us what to think. Because the fact of the matter is, it's our earning the answers ourselves that may well be the instigating factor that tells the ET civilization that it's time now for us to be prepared for this. Because I don't think they want to shock us. They have no desire to shock us and to traumatize us. They've been working at this thing for thousands of years. And so the question is whether or not we are ready for this experience. And we have to get ourselves ready for this experience. So I think that if we have an open minds ministry, basically, and we organize our people on a parish level and a congregation level through the churches and through the synagogues and through the mosques, by having these discussions of these profound philosophical and theological questions at the behest of the Vatican itself, that's asked that we all do this. So that to the degree to which people need some kind of authorization still, or some kind of authentication for the legitimacy of this process, we should do this. And that the fact that Patrick Leahy, who is the chairman, the Democratic Party chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, has said that he thought that there ought to be a commission established to investigate the crimes of the George Bush Jr. administration. One of the major reasons why the Democratic Party doesn't want to do that is because they don't think it can be confined to them. Because the minute you start looking at their crimes, what they're going to say is, look, don't come pointing at me.
That's right.
All we've done is done things a little more forthrightly that you guys have been doing in the past.
That's exactly
and so
right.
the Democratic Party knows that they're going to be intimidated out of that. So that the political system isn't going to make that decision for itself within the two-party structure. So there needs to be a grassroots movement that has not only a philosophical and a theological task that we're all engaged in together, but it's a public policy task in which we assemble our own citizens commission to decide among ourselves who the people are that should be on this commission, what are the protocols pursuant to which this commission should function, what are the demands that they're going to make on the governing structures, and if the governing structures don't respond, are we willing to mobilize ourselves to replace those people in a democratic system? Because when all is said and done, I
Create
don't
a new party, it sounds like what you're
to
saying.
create a new political party if necessary. But we're going to give them every opportunity. We're going to give them every chance to cooperate. We don't want them all to take their ball and run home. You know, we want them to participate in this. We're trying to draw them out on this thing. And I believe that if we look at a 4-year process here, you know, if we look to this starting now in 2010, and we mobilize ourselves, we all have to prepare for whatever events might be coming down in December of 2012, whatever that might be. We may just cross some invisible line at that particular time. It was the turning point of our human family, and that our future is starting to unfold in a positive way from there. But there are certain things that our political system is abjectly refusing to deal with. We do not have to tolerate two political parties that are dominated by the major corporations who are now been authorized by the Robertson Court to give it all the campaign
That's
contributions
right.
they want to.
Exactly.
To basically control our policies with regard to global warming so that they continue to rape and pillage and garner their massive profits for themselves while we all get poisoned and inundated with water. You know, we don't have to tolerate that. This is an emergency situation that we have already.
Yeah, I take your point. It's a tough climb. This is a tough hill to climb here.
Yes.
Because we're dealing with a very, very entrenched political process. And we're still dealing, ultimately, with a fairly low level of public knowledge of even the reality of the UFO phenomenon. Yes, many people believe that there's something to UFOs. Every opinion poll seems to indicate at least half or even a slight majority believe.
Yeah.
But there's really not a lot of consciousness about it. So I think one of the things that has to be done if we're going to get a grassroots movement going is a lot of public education, and really even starting with the basics.
That's right.
Why this is such a big deal. Pointing out examples of, you know, fundamental evidence for the reality of the UFO phenomenon and for the reality of the cover-up. Both of us have hundreds of stories, personal stories that we've probably gotten from a number of individuals, as well as documentary evidence. And I think any grassroots organization has got to find a way to make this type of information available.
That's right. And through
the
the internet. I think if we establish an Open Minds Ministry website where the classic items are available for people.
Right.
For example, your 3 volumes, and you finish all 3 of them. You got 2 of them already.
Right.
That we put them on the internet and say, here's how they're available. We
Like
refer them
UFOs
to key.
101.
Yeah,
sort of
101.
thing.
Here's the course.
Here it is.
Here's the course. This is our self-education. You know that you know, we're not going to, but it's got to
true,
be
yeah.
upward, positive, forward. Upward, positive, forward. We don't want to get into establishing an antagonistic relationship with the government. We don't want to get into an antagonistic relationship with the churches or the synagogues in their present state. That we want to move forward. And I must say, I personally find that this clarion call that was issued in November, on that November 10th date of 2009 by the Vatican, to call forth the request for our human family to begin to answer and consider these profound philosophical and theological questions. They're the key to the political realm. That only by answering the philosophical and theological questions are we going to free ourselves up to and empower ourselves to confront the political questions that need to be done. Because ultimately, our political philosophy is totally derivative of our philosophy. And our philosophy is in turn totally derivative of what the particular mode of ethical reasoning is that we're going to be using. And all of that derives from our answering of these profound theological and philosophical questions.
Well, what I like is even a little more pragmatic than that, frankly, which is that I look at the political system as hidebound and set in cement here. But it's, you know, you've opened my mind to the possibility that another major institution, the religious institutions, could be kind of an end run around the ossified political process.
That's exactly
and
right.
so I think that's a real opportunity. And I think it's something that we really should pursue.
That's right, and I think that's right. And so therefore that I'm inviting you into the Open Minds Ministry, to help provide the kind of detailed factual information that people are going to have, to do UFOs and ET 101. And then we'll be
Yes,
having further
absolutely.
dialogues about the theological
Absolutely.
and philosophical questions we need to do. And I'm glad we both ended up here at the Congress this year together.
Me too. Actually, it was wonderful.
Terrific.